Hello and welcome to Deviant's World. I'm Eric Servini. Today I'm here with Eliel Cruz, the Director of Communications for the New York City AntiViolence Project, an organization dedicated to ending violence against LGBTQ persons and HIV-affected communities. Cruz is also an organizer, activist, and writer. He's a co-organizer and media lead for the Brooklyn Liberation March, an action for Black trans lives that drew over 15,000 people last month. He's spoken across the country on issues pertaining to the LGBTQ plus community, media representation, as well as faith and sexuality at universities and conferences alike. He was featured as the most recent Out 100 list for his work on AVP and in fighting for justice for Layla Blanco. Thank you so much, Eliel, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I love that we both have plants behind us too, by the way. I just got my first.
This one is it's struggling. So I always like when I'm talking to activists and advocates to start with the origin story, to figure out how in the world did you become involved in your brand of activism. And so I'm curious, what is, your early life? What did it look like?
My origin story is odd. Or at least I think about it, because when I think about myself growing up as like a closeted queer kid, I never thought I would be speaking about my sexuality as public as I am. In fact, like I vowed to just like I was going to be out, but like quietly and just like live my like kind of mundane life. But I grew up in the Seventh-day Adventist church, like all the way through college. So I only went to Seventh-day Adventist schools my entire life, and it's a pretty conservative religion. It's very similar to like Mormonism, and there's a lot of like cultural aspects to the faith as well. So it wasn't just like going to church once a week. It just like encompassed every aspect of my life down to my schooling. But I started my work while going to Andrews University, which is the flagship school of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Michigan. And I found myself in a situation where I felt unsafe due to my sexual orientation, and I needed support from my university. But I was very concerned that me going to them with what was going on to me was going to end up harming me and actually getting me potentially expelled because of my queerness. So that situation was resolved, and I actually had a really supportive administration that supported me through that process, despite what I assumed. But I realized that I had come out again and again, as well do, a lot younger when I was a teenager, and I had a supportive family, and I was like terrified in that moment that I was going to be expelled. So I knew that there was a lot of other LGBTQ students on campus going through a variety of issues that just like were not being heard. So it just kind of snowballed. Like it became, I like started to organize on campus. I created really what was more of a support group versus a GSA of LGBTQ students who were facing a variety of issues, from being kicked out of their homes, suicidality, harassment on campus from other students or professors. I created some, changes in our student code of conduct around LGBTQ students, and it just snowballed into this like whole thing. The group is still meeting 8-9 years later.
Wow.
And I just started my advocacy by organizing on campus, and I started writing because of it while I was still in undergrad and speaking about my work, and I just never stopped.
Wow. And so how does your faith play into your activism now? Are you still a part of the community, or how do you navigate those two parts of your identity?
I mean, I'm definitely still a person of faith. I haven't engaged in like explicitly religious spaces years for a variety of reasons. I've been saying recently that I'm like detoxing from really what was a lot of religious violence that I experienced, and trying to like heal from that. But I still say, like, I still very much see my faith guiding the work that I do, in that I find myself still really driven by like Jesus' story, like just as like a story, right, of an individual who like met people at their most basic needs of healing them, providing them food, and supporting them in just the most basic needs. I find there to be like holiness in working with those who are most harmed, in that I believe that's like work that I'm called to do in a very like spiritual sense. I don't know if that makes sense,
Totally.
but like I still feel like there's such yeah, that like my faith is still the center of my work in that sense that I see the humanity in people, and I want to do everything that I can to support folks in society's most marginalized. So
Hmm.
a little
Absolutely.
bit, but
No, I think it makes complete sense. And I was lucky to have been raised in a very progressive Christian church. And one of the things I learned was that, the teachings of Jesus, despite what institutions will have you believe, are actually very radical.
yeah,
And very, like you look at the actual words, what he's saying about distribution of wealth and about giving back. And these are very, very radical propositions. And so, I think getting involved in social justice is the ultimate fulfillment of that. So I know you currently work with the Anti-Violence Project, and I'm curious about how you first found out about this organization and what made you first get involved.
so yeah, so I first found out about the Anti-Violence Project through Chris Tuttle, who was then the director of communications at Glisten. They needed someone who, because our team is just me and one other staffer in the communications department of an organization of almost 40 people. So
Wow.
they kind of needed someone who is like who can fill a bunch of different types of comms roles, and can do kind of innovative comms and digital comms. So I found out about AVP about 3-4 years ago, and I've been at AVP now for 2.5 years as the director of communications. What was the second part of your question? So sorry.
What does it do? What does the organization do?
Thanks so much. So, so we're working to end violence against LGBTQ and HIV affected peoples, right? So we're a New York City based org. We do direct service work through our client services department. We run a 24/7 hotline for LGBTQ people who have experienced all forms of violence, whether it be domestic violence, police violence, hate
Mhm.
violence. We get calls nationally for folks if people are in active crisis. I need someone to support them through that. We also have folks who call, if you're in New York City based, you can engage our various services, such as like our short-term counseling for those who have either just experienced or have experienced in the past some traumatic event that they need to talk through, etc. We do a bunch of trainings. Our legal department is a small but mighty team that mainly does immigration. I want to say mainly, but the bulk of our work right now is immigration, as it's shifted the last few years, predominantly underneath the Trump administration.
Mhm.
A lot of asylum cases, but we do a lot of work with housing law and family matters as well. And then we have an organizing team, a community organizing and public advocacy team, which does all of our front-facing advocacy on the city and state level, really pushing campaigns like our work to decriminalize sex work. We work also with Communities United for Police Reform and have been active in the Defund NYPD campaigns,
Mhm.
working to end solitary confinement in New York City, ending cash bail, a variety of different amazing campaigns that our team works on. So yeah, we do a lot of stuff. It's kind of hard to keep track of all the amazing things my colleagues do, but yeah.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people out there are just waking up to this epidemic of violence that's occurring in America. And I was looking at AVP's website and going to the blog, and I'm curious what kind of news has been coming out. And as I was scrolling down, I think the headlines really speak for themselves. So the most recent posts are AVP mourns the death of Brayla Stone, a 17-year-old black transgender woman in Arkansas. Next, AVP mourns the death of Mercy Mack, a 22-year-old transgender woman in Dallas, Texas. Next, AVP mourns the death of Jane Thompson, a 33-year-old white transgender woman in Aurora, Colorado. Selena Reyes Hernandez in Chicago, Illinois. Dominique Remay Fells in Philadelphia. And all of those were posted within a week of one another. And I'm wondering if you can give us some insight into what is happening in America and what especially Black trans women are up against right now.
Yeah, so part of my job at ABP is to track incidents of violence nationally, and so I work both when we get tips or calls, either through a hotline or through a national coalition of anti-violence programs that we coordinate, as well as in just media reports and then social media reports as these deaths come. So I am constantly monitoring the news for these homicides, and there has been, as you just said, like a string of homicides in the past. I think even just the 6 weeks, and this year, I believe we're on track to be at the highest level of homicides we've seen against Black trans folks. If we continue at the rate that we have so far. So this year in particular has been quite intense. I think things are quite and compounded by the pandemic, by growing tensions with people generally, because things are just like really tense and a lot right now. But this like epidemic has been happening for a very long time. There's been, we've seen a disproportionate amount of predominantly Black trans women murdered and taken again and again and again for years and years and years. I do see that there is a growing number of people finally paying attention and talking about it, right? That's even just by like the Brooklyn Liberation March that we did in June, where over 15,000 people came, which was shocking, right? At AVP, we do vigils and rallies when someone is murdered or taken from us in New York City, and prior to that, the largest rally I had helped organize was for Layla Blanco, and that about 700 people came last June in 2019. But more typically, we have 30 to 50 people come if we're lucky. That's like average, normal, right? For LGBTQ people generally, we had a Black queer man was shot and killed by police, Kowalski Trawick, in April of 2019. We helped organize that with local New York, a partner organization. 30-something people came. But so generally people do not show up. But there's been, for folks who have been murdered and taken from us, but there has been a string and an ongoing amount of violence against Black trans women. And it seems like we are in a place where people are starting to at least pay more attention and are lifting up the names of those who we have lost, and also their stories, because it becomes really numerical really quickly, right? Because if it just becomes like a tally, and I think folks have in community are trying to do do a concerted effort to make sure that we are humanizing the individual and their full story, their dreams and aspirations, and not just their story limited to the violence and the death. But I mean, it's ongoing. It's horrific. It's the most depressing part of my job.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think one of the silver linings of that you mentioned is the sheer magnitude of that march that you helped organize, and I think that is, even though the context is so depressing, I think to see that magnitude is really remarkable. And you mentioned also talking about the full lives of these individuals, and in addition to the violence that they encountered. And one of the names you mentioned was Layla Blanco, whose death and activism surrounding it is really the first time I heard of AVP and you individually. So I'm wondering if you could talk to us a bit about who Layla was, and then also what happened.
Yeah, so Layla Blanco was a 27-year-old Afro-Latinx trans woman. She was part of the House of Extravaganza, the ballroom scene. She was very accepted in that space, and also her bio family was also really accepting of the House of Extravaganza too, to the point where they included the House Extravaganza in her last name in her death certificate to make sure that they that piece. And they've always invited Laylene's daughters, the trans girls that she would take under her wing to Christmas, and they would just hang out at the house all the time. That Chosen and Blood family are super close, and they just vibe really well. So she was a 27-year-old Black trans woman that was found dead in her cell at Rikers on June 7th, 2019. We at AVP heard about her death through a 4-sentence article in the New York Post later that evening. A transgender inmate was found unresponsive. We worked that weekend to find out more information, and we began to organize a rally. And that Monday, we had about 700 people come to that first initial rally. We were connected with Layleen's family throughout the weekend, and also the lawyers who they had retained in order to find out more information about Layleen. But she was being held at Rikers for an alleged incident of an alleged assault against a taxi driver, is what is being said. It's hard to confirm that because we can't find the taxi driver, but that's what it has said. And she had prior a prostitution charge that was brought against her through a sex sting operation with the Vice Squad, and that was why she was being detained on a $501 bail that she couldn't afford. She had schizophrenia and epileptic disorder that Rikers was aware of. And she was put into solitary confinement in a couple of weeks into her being detained, and she died. She died due to a seizure that she couldn't make out of. I actually don't talk about Layleen in public like this because I get emotional. Sorry. So this past year, AVP has we've become close and supported the Polanco family in their quest to fight justice for their daughter and their sister. The family currently has a civil suit against the city. In June, we found out that the Bronx DA they released a report and claimed no criminal negligence, and weren't going to press charges against those who held Layleen in their care and custody. But we also released a video in June of the correctional officers of the day that had passed, which they opened her cell door and laughed, presumably while she was dying or perhaps when she was dead, just moments before she was pronounced dead. In response to that and the video, and also a bunch of different calls from folks like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to fire the correctional officers. Wow. 17 correctional officers have been disciplined. We don't really know with what. A couple of them without pay is what we know, but I don't know what disciplined exactly is. And the mayor has announced allegedly a plan to end solitary confinement in New York City. I say allegedly because the mayor has had a plan to close Rikers for years, and yet Rikers is still holding and murdering people. Yep. But that's kind of been the response. So that is Layleen, and what happened to her. She was a beautiful soul who loved house music and clubbing and people and taking care of animals, and she is sorely missed by all who knew her and loved her.
Thank you for giving not just the details of what happened, but also the full portrait of who she was. It is a tragedy. I was familiar with her name and of course, what had happened to her, but not the entire richness of her life, which I think is so important. So thank you for providing that. And also, when I was doing a deep dive into her case, some of the things that stood out to me were just how many problems, like systematic issues that she encountered that I think really shed light on, how many layers of persecution and of just social fuck-uppery that there is on so many different levels. And I'm hoping we can unpack them because, starting with the beginning and so many of the things that she was up against also are issues that AVP is fighting against. And I wanted to start with her arrest, which was for sex work. And you mentioned the Vice Squad, which is actually something I've studied a bit in terms of the use of police departments' Vice Squads in criminalizing, in this case, it's sex work. But before then, in addition to sex work, throughout mid-century America and up until very recently, was criminalizing homosexual activity, right? And so, the opening scene in my book is a man getting arrested because he's in a public restroom, and there are two police officers hidden in the ceiling, waiting to catch homosexuals. And what I found so striking about Layleen's case is that the person she was caught with was a police officer who was actually essentially entrapping her. So could you talk to me about why that's so wrong, and why it's so important to be decriminalizing sex work, especially for people like Layleen who may not have had other opportunities for employment?
Yeah, so she didn't, right? So she didn't have other opportunities, and it's so what's interesting and about Layleen's case, outside of I say interesting because it's horrific.
Right.
But what you can see with her is this like blueprint in how so many Black and brown trans women are profile targeted and kind of funneled through this system that is violent and for many of them leads to their death, right? So Layleen's sex work came out of necessity. It was actually the last conversation that Melania, Layleen's sister, had with Layleen was about Layleen's frustrations. Melania has shared stories with me of Layleen going into like McDonald's that have like open like hiring now signs outside and being refused job applications because she was clocked as a trans woman. ABP in 2015 worked then with our lead organizer Layla to organize these town halls with transgender non-conforming people in New York. Over 500 or 600 people submitted responses to a survey, and what we found was this widespread employment discrimination that just created systemic barriers for TGNC people to be able to receive employment. And like so many LGBTQ people as a whole, really, but especially trans women, sex work is their means for survival, and their criminalization of it is an LGBTQ issue. Like you said, vice squads have been used to criminalize homosexuality in the past, and a lot of LGBTQ people in our community currently, especially those who are white and cis, do not realize the continued criminalizations of queer people, our bodies, and our means for survival. It doesn't impact them directly anymore. And so we forget about it, and yet people are being entrapped and essentially being led to their death through this violent system, because the police are fucked up.
Right.
That's like the best way to say it. And like they don't, and they haven't been friends of our community. So yeah, I mean, Layleen's story touches sex work. It touches the need for reforming cash bail. It touches, the need to abolish prisons as a whole, and especially the use of solitary confinement, which is torture. It really touches on a lot of aspects of the criminal legal system, which continues to enact violence against our communities.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's so important, especially when talking about sex work, is that very rarely does someone grow up, as a child wanting to be a sex worker. Maybe, but very unlikely. And so, as you said, it's a survival mechanism up against a society that has placed them there and forced them to utilize this survival mechanism. Just as, gay men in the 50s and 60s had sex with one another in public restrooms because they literally had nowhere else to go to find any sort of romantic connection. And, so this is society placing people into positions they don't want to be in and then punishing them. And I think it's important to recognize, especially in a case like this, just as if you were arrested for homosexual activity back in the 50s or 60s or beyond, in this case, if you're arrested for sex work, that marks you for the rest of your life, right? That follows you forever and essentially creates a caste system, right? And so
and really, whether people are, do it for survival or because they want to, because it is freeing and it is their bodies and they enjoy sex work, like the government should not be criminalizing consensual acts between two adults. Like period, right? Because like I know it's really easy and quickly to turn sex work into this thing where it's like, oh, folks are only doing this because they have no other options, which is true for a lot of people. And even some people who have other options enjoy sex work as a job because it's a job and that's what they want to do. And I think that is also should be included in these narratives around sex work. And regardless of how people or why people are doing sex work, it shouldn't be criminalized at all.
Right. And on top of that, there's this other law that I wasn't as familiar with until I was preparing for this interview, which is walking while trans. And that's something, that sort of policy is something that AVP is also fighting against. Could you talk to me about what walking while trans, what these types of laws or policies mean? What do they look like?
Yeah, so the walking while trans ban, as it is the loitering for the purpose of prostitution charge, which is used predominantly and indiscriminately to target, profile, and arrest Black and brown trans women who either are or are suspected of being sex workers. So what this looks like is police officers seeing trans women on the streets, sometimes with their boyfriends or by themselves or with friends, and being arrested because they assume that they're doing sex work. I believe that this is still the case in New York. Also, if a trans woman or anyone who is suspected of being a sex worker has more than 2 or 3 condoms on them, that is enough evidence to charge them with that sex work charge. Yeah, which was a big reason a lot of sex workers, there's a bunch of things that people do to like hide their condoms and hide like other uses of protection because they could be used against them as evidence as them doing sex work. And obviously that's problematic for a variety of reasons, particularly for both themselves and their clients not being able to be as safe as they would like to because of STIs, XYZ. So yeah, that's the what walking while trans is, and it has we have the support to get it repealed. It wasn't taken up to a vote this past session. We got a lot of support in June, which was surprising. I think it was just a moment because folks have been trying to get this repealed for a very long time. Yeah, that's what walking while trans is in New York.
And once again, I hope that people listening, if you look like me, if you're a cis gay white guy, recognize that these exact same laws were also used against us, right? And now that we don't have to put up with it, they're now being used against another more marginalized group. And, there was a day in which the arrests, if it wasn't for sodomy, because that's very hard to prove, just like in this case, sex work is very hard to actually be engaging in that activity. It's hard to prove. So you're literally just arresting for people on the presumption that they may or may not be doing a crime, just as back in the day, gay men were arrested because they may or may not have been looking for homosexual activity. So I hope people understand how our struggles in this case are so connected. And you brought up the repeal and some of the political progress and the battle that has been continuing for so long against it. So I'm wondering, for people who have now heard the case of Layleen and want to fight against this epidemic that's occurring in our country, what can we do? Especially if you look like me, maybe you have a job miraculously during this time and want to give back. What can we do?
So with Layleen in particular, the family has a civil suit against the city, and they have upcoming court cases in the next few months. Historically, pre-pandemic, we would have packed the court, which would have meant that we would have mobilized as many people as possible to show up and fill the seats in the court itself. Helps the judge know that people are paying attention to one. Now, the pandemic are virtual, that we're packing the court, because they're all being kind of, we'll be sending out things at AVP around supporting the family as they continue with their civil case. We're still trying to get people to the mayor to fire all those involved with Layleen's death, not just suspensions or being reprimanded or write up. So we've been calling for the mayor to do that. I actually have in AVP's Instagram link currently. There's a take action for Justice for Layleen, which we did a digital action last week, where we flooded the mayor's Instagram with comments demanding that he fire the correctional officers
Wow.
and to end solitary confinement. Currently, we got like over 1,000 comments. I'm happy to continue to flood the mayor's Instagram so we can continue to do that, which is great. But broadly and more generally, I think in terms of like epidemic of violence against LGBTQ people as a whole, but especially Black trans women, I think it's really important for us to continue to pay attention as these stories come up. It is important, like, don't just keep scrolling, don't just quickly repost. Like, do what you can to like engage that story and find out this person's whole life. Find out if their friends and family are raising money in their GoFundMe. Give to those GoFundMes. Tell other friends that this continues to happen. So much happens, and the state. I said, the state, and also our communities who are enacting violence against trans folks get away with literally murder when we're not paying attention as a community. So paying attention, engaging in with folks, with those who we have lost, full stories, trying to find ways to give back to their families, their surviving families, as they can. But we lift all these things up on AVP social channels. I do it on mine as well. I generally, broadly, especially after the uprisings that happened in June, I've been encouraging people to take 3 to 5 actions a week, whether it be a phone call, donating something, putting in your budget, whatever those actions may be, talking to your white family members about race, whatever those actions may be, but just incorporating into your life and everyday life. So there's a lot of different things, but AVP lifts up all those different actions as they come out.
Absolutely. And for people who may be listening, where can they go on social media? What are the handles for both AVP and for you?
Yeah, so AVP on all social medias is at AntiViolence, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. My Twitter is just my name, Eliel Cruz. And Instagram is the Eliel Cruz, because whoever has Eliel Cruz is not giving it up.
Oh no. Maybe that'll be our next pressure campaign after we've solved the epidemic. We'll move on to that.
Well, they have like and they're locked. And Selena Gomez tagged me in something last month, but it wasn't me. It was that person. And I was like, I need that name, but it's fine.
That's so funny. Cervini is an auto repair shop, or no, it's like a detailing shop in like New York or something. So anytime people go to Cervini's, like they get all these ads for like pimping out their ride and stuff. So don't be confused. I have no affiliation, but I support it. Eliel Cruz, thank you so much for joining and for sharing not just your story, but also Layleen's. I hope everyone listening recognizes that we do have a moral obligation to be joining your battle and Layleen's fight in her memory, because we've messed up in the past. And, I'm a historian, and that's the first thing I've learned is how we have forgotten so many within our community. And now is the time to make that right. So Eliel, thank you again for joining, and everyone, I will see you next week.